In the next video, it's called Spring26. We're going to finish this chapter number 7. And if you go into your book, you can see that there's different ways in which evolution can occur. And one of them is allopatric speciation. Another one is phyletic gradualism. And another one is punctuated equilibrium. Let's talk about these. First one is allopatric speciation. How does allopatric speciation lead to new species evolving from older species? Here you can see a picture showing how allopatric speciation might occur, for example, with finches, like the finches that Darwin saw in the Galapagos Islands. You had an ancestral species here on the South American mainland. Then they migrated to one of the Galapagos Islands, and the birds on this island would develop different beaks because maybe there were insects there. They needed thin, delicate beaks. Maybe some of the birds migrated from there to another island where nuts were the dominant food source, and they developed heavier beaks. And each island, the birds evolved differently until finally these four populations became much different. And there, over a long period of time, you would develop separate species on these different islands. So allopatric speciation occurs due to gene pools being separated. Now, what's a gene pool? Well, you know now that genes are traits that we inherit through our DNA. And if you take a look at this next picture here, let's say we have another way to think about allopatric speciation. Think of this large green circle being a gene pool. And so this is the original population of anything. We can make it turtles. And so these turtles, they lived in this area. And they could all breed with one another because they all lived in this one area. They all had reproductive access to one another. And so they were one population. Now let's say that a mountain building episode occurred. So a mountain range rose up through plate tectonics, and we know that mountain ranges can form. So let's say this was a plate boundary, and the mountain range divided this original population into two separate populations. If you think about it, this subgroup here would not have easy reproductive access, no longer have reproductive access to the ones over here, because the mountain range is between the two. It'd be very difficult for turtles to climb thousands of feet over the mountains to get to the other side. So what happens over a long period of time is that the population on this side will evolve to the conditions existing west of this mountain range, and to the east of the mountain range, this population would adapt to a different set of environmental conditions. Therefore, the DNA of these populations become more and more different until finally they become separate populations. That's one way you can form new species. When a geographic barrier separates a population to smaller populations or smaller gene pools, and that they evolve differently on both sides of the geographic barrier, forming new species. That's called allopatric speciation. Okay, next one we're going to talk about is phyletic gradualism. Charles Darwin was a firm believer in phyletic gradualism. Now, what does that mean? Well, the way Darwin looked at evolution was this. You have a generation of some organism, and that population, you have individuals who are competing for survival. and certain traits will give certain individuals a higher chance of survival, so that the next generation will be slightly different genetically. And the next generation after that will be slightly different. The generation after that will be slightly different. And as you go through the long periods of time, maybe millions of years, then this population has become much different than its ancestral population, and than the ancestral population. It did so slowly and gradually. And these slow, gradual changes over long periods of time lead to the evolution of much different species. Let's see how that would work. So phyletic gradualism is what we're talking about now. Phyletic gradualism. And people who believe in phyletic gradualism would point to horses. So 55 million years ago, at the beginning of the Cenozoic era, the ancestor of horses was called Hyracotherium. And it had 5 toes, and it had very small, delicate teeth. Now, later on we'll talk more about this, but I'm going to give you some basic zoology here. Animals that have hooves are called ungulates. Mammals that have hooves are called ungulates. And ungulates are hooved mammals, and they are herbivores, meaning they are plant eaters. These herbivores, these ungulate herbivores, can have either low crown teeth or high crown teeth. What's the difference? Well, low crown teeth are like this, small and delicate with lots of crenulations. And herbivore ungulates who have low crown teeth are a type of mammal called a grazer. Called a browser. Not an internet browser, but a mammal browser. Meaning browsers are herbivores, ungulate herbivores, who eat tender leaves off of trees. What kind of creatures are they? Well, they include things like sloths. Let's take a look at some. Sloths. These are sloths. They have low crown teeth, and they have very small, delicate teeth and to tear apart leaves. Koala bears have low crown teeth. They eat leaves off of trees. They live in the trees. Sometimes they're on the ground, but they always have low crown teeth. On the other hand, things like cows and sheep. Cows have high crown teeth because they are not browsers, but they're grazers. So grazing animals like goats and sheep and cows have high crown teeth. What does that mean? Well, high crown teeth are like this. Modern horses have high crown teeth. Look how tall the teeth are. Look how the tooth enamel is very thick. These are big teeth. Why do they have such huge teeth? Why do ungulate grazers have high crown teeth? Well, it's because they eat grass. And if you eat grass, there's lots of sand and grit that you also eat when you chew on grass. And so you need lots of tooth enamel. Otherwise, you get tooth decay very easily. So take a look at what happened to horses. About 55 to 50 million years ago, they had low crown teeth, meaning that they ate leaves off of trees. But when you get to the modern horse, they have high crown teeth because they ate grass. So one of the things that happened to horses over the years from 55 million years ago till now is they shifted from having low crown teeth to high crown teeth. And that meant that their diet changed from leaves to grass. You can see that in the distant past, they had 5 toes, and then they went back to 3 toes. Now almost all horses have 1 toe, which is the hoof. What else has happened to horses gradually over time? Well, notice that their body size has increased. See, their body size has increased. And look at the skull. The volume of their skull, the size of their skull has increased, meaning a larger brain. So horses have slowly evolved to eat grass and therefore developed high crown teeth, and grass became more and more common during the Cenozoic era. So horses evolved to live on the grasslands. Why did they go from 5 toes down to 1 toe? It's always the same reason. For evolution, it's always the same reason. There's an advantage to losing your toes. What's the advantage? You can run faster and therefore get away from prey easier, therefore giving you a higher chance of survival. Why did they get larger and larger brains? Well, again, Darwin's theory is the same. There must be an advantage to having a larger brain. What would the advantage be for the horse? Well, maybe if you were more intelligent, you could figure out ways of escaping from predators more easily. You could plan better when you're in a pack of horses, which direction to go, how to work together to beat off an attack. Body size increases. Well, what's the reason for that? Again, the same reason. There must be an advantage to having a larger body for a horse. If you were a larger horse, maybe you could survive an attack from a predator more easily. But phyletic gradualism basically means that species evolve slowly over long periods of time, and they change a little bit each time, in each generation being slightly different, until finally the species becomes much different. That's what phyletic gradualism means. Darwin was of the belief that that's how evolution proceeds, slowly over long periods of time, each generation slightly different than the previous. But in the 1970s, a new idea came up, and that was called punctuated equilibrium. So that's what we want to talk about next. So people who believe in punctuated equilibrium, they point to the fossil record, and they say, well, what about cockroaches? And what about other creatures? They don't change at all for millions of years. For over hundreds of millions of years, cockroaches have stayed the same. Why? Because there's no reason to change. Sometimes everybody gets to pass on their DNA. If there's plenty of food around and a lack of predators around, everybody passes their DNA on. So here's phyletic gradualism: slow changes, and finally you get a different species, and then you get another different species. But the punctuated equilibrium people say, no, what really happens is that sometimes a species doesn't change at all because there's no reason for it to change. There's no environmental stressors out there to force it to change. And then all of a sudden there's a rapid evolution. And then there's a long periods of time where no evolution occurs. And then there's a big jump. Okay, now people who believe in punctuated equilibrium will point to mammals, for example. Mammals from 245 to 65 million years ago barely changed. There were 4 species of mammals, and they barely changed. The change was very, very small. And sometimes they didn't change at all. Why? Well, think about it. 245 to 65 million years ago is the Mesozoic era. We'll talk about that later on. The Mesozoic era. It's the era where dinosaurs dominated the earth. We'll talk about dinosaurs later on. But 245 to 65 million years ago, the Mesozoic era, the age of the dinosaurs. During that time, mammals, there were only 3 to 4 species, and they lived in fear of the dinosaurs. Why? Because the dinosaurs occupied every ecological niche. The large predators of the Mesozoic era were things like Tyrannosaurus rex and Allosaurus, large bipedal, that means they walked on 2 legs, carnivorous dinosaurs with sharp teeth. The big herbivores were occupied by large plant-eating dinosaurs. The scavengers of the world were pterosaurs, flying reptiles. So mammals could not evolve during the Mesozoic era. Then what happened 65 million years ago? The dinosaurs were wiped off the face of the earth. And we'll talk about why that happened later on. But just 65 million years ago, every single dinosaur disappeared. Then mammals, after 65 million years ago, could evolve into the myriad of different forms we see today. The big predators could evolve to saber-toothed cats, cave bears, dire wolves, and hominids, humans. The plant eaters were buffalo and cows and goats and sheep and all of the other plant-eating mammals. We have scavengers like hyenas and jackals. So what happens, according to the punctuated equilibrium people, is evolution does not occur for long amounts of time, and then all of a sudden there are these large jumps. And their argument is, if these people are right, if the phyletic gradualism people are right, what about the missing links? Sometimes you see these slow gradual changes. You just see one species of mammal, and then later on you find another that's much different, and another one that's much different. You don't see these slow gradual steps. Who's right? Well, the jury's still out. If we find more of the missing links and we can find every step along the way, like we have with the horses, then phyletic gradualism is probably the correct mechanism for evolution. That's what causes evolution to occur, if we can find the missing links. For example, we have found all of the missing links for whales, even going back to their land ancestors. So the people who believe in phyletic gradualism say eventually we're going to find enough fossils to complete all of the different steps to show that species really do evolve step by step, slowly over long periods of time. The people who believe in punctuated equilibrium will say, well, you've got your horses and your whales, but almost everything else, we don't have all the intermediate fossils. And what that indicates is that species do not change for long. Evolution does not occur for long periods of time, and occurs only in rapid steps when there is a dramatic environmental change, such as the dinosaurs getting wiped out. Okay, now there's different kinds of evolution. There's divergent, parallel, and convergent evolution. So there's 3 kinds of evolution we're going to talk about now. And they are divergent, convergent, and parallel evolution. Okay, let's talk about divergent evolution, and then write this down in your notes. Three kinds of evolution you need to know about: divergent evolution, convergent evolution, and parallel evolution. Okay? Let's see what the difference is. Before we can talk about divergent evolution, I have to tell you about what this diagram is. This diagram with straight line segments like this, showing different species and how they evolved from more ancient ancestors. This type of diagram is a diagram used by biologists, and it's called a cladogram. A cladogram. So cladograms are diagrams like this with line segments showing the evolutionary relationships between more modern species on the top and more ancient ones on the bottom. Okay? So this cladogram here shows you, for example, that this shrew-like mammal was the ancestor of all of these types of mammals: deer, camels, whales, sea cows, elephants, hyraxes, and horses. It also shows you that camels are more closely related to deer than they are to whales. And it also shows you that whales, camels, and deer are more closely related to each other than these other four mammals. This cladogram shows you horses are more closely related to hyraxes than they are to sea cows or elephants. These cladograms are based on DNA and also on physical attributes. Okay, so divergent evolution can be shown by this cladogram, where many species come from one common ancestor. We call that divergent evolution, where many different species or genuses come from more ancient common ancestors. That's divergent evolution. Okay, let's talk about the next one. Now we're going to talk about convergent evolution. Convergent evolution. Converge means to come together. Now, to show you how convergent evolution works, let's take a look at these three different types of creatures. You have dolphins, sharks, and ichthyosaurs. You already know what a dolphin is. It's a mammal. It breathes through lungs, not through gills. Sharks are a type of fish. Ichthyosaurs this is a marine reptile that lived during the Mesozoic, during the time of the dinosaurs. It's a marine reptile. We'll talk more about them later. But do you notice that they all have a similar body shape? They look similar when you look at them, right? They have similar physical attributes, even though they are much different types of animals. The shark is a fish, the ichthyosaur is a reptile, and the dolphin is a mammal. So they're not closely related, even though they look the same. So convergent evolution is when you have many much different animals developing the same body shape. Why did this occur? Why did we get this convergent evolution? Why did this occur? And the reason why it occurs is because each of these, the shark, the dolphin, and the ichthyosaur, led a similar lifestyle. They had to have a streamlined body, and this dorsal fin and the pectoral fin and tail fin all is the best configuration for traveling quickly through the ocean to catch your prey. So there are only Mother Nature only has some body forms that work to solve different problems in nature. To solve the problem of being a fast swimmer and a predator, this is the shape that works. So they all developed the same shape because this is the shape that worked. Other body forms that did not work, we'll look at later. But this is what works. Another way of thinking about convergent evolution is think about mosquitoes and bats and birds. They all have wings, don't they? They all have a similar body shape. They're made to fly. But one is an insect, one is a mammal, and one is a bird. That's convergent evolution, when you have distantly related organisms developing similar body forms. That's convergent evolution. Parallel evolution is something different. Parallel evolution is when you have closely related species, such as the elephant and the mastodon. The mastodon's now extinct, but the elephant is still with us today. The mastodon lived during the Ice Age. Clearly, they have a similar body form. They have a long trunk, big floppy ears, similar body shape. They're close in body form, and they're closely related because they came from a common ancestor. That's parallel evolution. See the difference? These are distantly related and develop the same body form. These are closely related and develop the same body form because they came from a common ancestor in the not too distant past. That's parallel evolution. Take a look at this creature here. This is called a titanotheres. I think you might find it somewhat interesting because we had these in Tennessee. A couple 100,000 years ago, we had these in Tennessee. These are ungulates. They're herbivores, and they're plant eaters, and they're grazers, and then later on they became browsers. But anyway, this is what these things look like. Huge, sometimes 10, 15 feet long. They were in the Johnson City area. Well, you can see that if you go back to 52 million years ago, they didn't have a horn. And then their head became a little bigger. They developed a horn, and then finally developed these large horns. So they slowly changed. This would be phyletic gradualism, by the way. What does that tell you with your knowledge of evolution? It tells you that there must be an advantage to having horns. What do you think that advantage would be? Maybe you'd be more able to protect yourself from a predator. Right? Also, think about if you're males. Males they might, like bighorn sheep, they'll butt heads to gain access to females. If you had large horns like this, you would win the battle and you'd get more likely to pass your DNA onwards. So, big horns might be a sexual attractant. And part of it, the evolution is due to sexual attraction. If you were a male and you had these big horns, you say, "Hey, baby, check out my big horn. He's got the little horn, and I've got the big horn." Sorry, you gotta have some humor here. Anyway, so this is called a phylogenetic tree, and it shows you. It's different from the cladogram, which was straight line segments. This sort of looks like the branching of a tree. So that's a difference between a phylogenetic tree and the cladogram. The cladogram shows you straight line segments, where these curvy lines like this are called, that's produced, we call that a phylogenetic tree. And here you can see that cats, horses, and opossum are more closely related to each other than they are to dinosaurs, salamanders, placoderms, lungfish, and sharks. And birds are different from all three. And they came from a common ancestor. This is a phylogenetic tree. Cladograms, on the other hand, are straight lines like this, and they're more useful for showing genetic relationships. For example, look at this cladogram. You've got cats, horses, opossum, birds, dinosaurs, salamanders, placoderms, an ancient type of fish, lungfish, and sharks. Who are cats most closely related to, according to in this cladogram? They're most closely related to who? A, sharks, B, horses, or C, dinosaurs? Well, the cladogram shows that cats are more closely related to the horses, and you can see they both have something in common. They both have a placenta, meaning that when you're in your mother's womb, you know about the placenta, right? We'll talk more about it, but it's a food source. So they both have that in common. Horses and cats are more closely related to a possum than they are to these others. Why? Because they all have body hair and mammary glands. That means milk-bearing glands. Then, if you go even further down this amniotic tree, dinosaurs, birds, opossum, horses, and cats are more closely related to one another than they are these other ones. Why? They all grew in their mother's womb in an amniotic egg. What is an amniotic egg? We'll talk more about it later, but I'll just introduce you to it here. When you were in your mother's womb, I know you don't remember it, but you grew up in an amniotic egg. And so there was this thing called the placenta. And so there's the embryo, and the embryo could feed off of a yolk sac in birds, but for humans it's a placenta. And then so you got a food source, and then you got also a place to get rid of your waste, which is called the allantois. And then you're separated from your mother's womb by this around you. So let's see if there's a picture of it here. It could either be, for some it would be a membrane, and for humans it's an amniotic cavity, but it's all the same structure. All amniotic eggs have an embryo, a food source. For us it's a placenta, for others it's a yolk sac, and then an allantois, which is a waste sac. And it's like a life support unit separated from the mother's womb. So all of these creatures here grew up in an amniotic egg: dinosaurs, birds, opossums, horses, and cats. So this cladogram shows you who is more closely related to whom. They all have something in common, though. They all have a vertebrate column. That's your spine. So why would all of these organisms have so much in common, no matter how far they are different they are genetically? The only explanation for that, ladies and gentlemen, is evolution. You cannot explain that with it if they were all created separately and they had never changed. Then why would they have so much in common? Is because they are related in some way. Take a look at these cladograms here. Okay, so what is the genetic relationship between dogs, birds, and bats? Well, we got three hypotheses here. And this cladogram here shows you hypothesis 1. Birds and bats are more closely related to one another than they are to dogs. Why? Because birds and bats both can fly and dogs can't. Hypothesis number 2. Birds and dogs are more closely related to one another than they are to bats. Why? Because birds and dogs are diurnal. They hunt and eat during the day and they sleep at night. Whereas Bats are nocturnal. They hunt at night and sleep during the day. Cladogram number 3. Bats and dogs are more closely related to one another than they are to birds. Why? Because bats and dogs are both mammals, and birds are not mammals. This one, the third one, is the correct cladogram, by the way. It's important to mention, and we're going to be talking about extinctions. Extinctions are when species disappear from the face of the earth, such as the dodo bird, the passenger pigeon, the Carolina parrot, the Tasmanian tiger. They are no longer here. 99% of all species that have ever lived have become extinct. And when mass extinctions occur, that means opportunity knocks for the survivors to evolve. Okay, we'll call it quits here, and then we'll talk about this next time.